According to an NPR article by Nina Totenberg in 2016, until 2016, the longest any Supreme Court justice had waited to be confirmed was 125 days. In 2016, President Obama nominated Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court, who waited over 10 months to be confirmed before ultimately being rejected. This was the first in a string of unprecedented Supreme Court nomination processes that have started to bring great scrutiny to the process. Each appointment is of major significance in American politics because the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. Additionally, there are infrequent appointments to the Supreme Court, as there may be one or two or maybe even no vacancies during a president's years in office. And finally, Supreme Court justices are given lifetime appointments, which create independence from the president and Congress, creating long ideological stances in the court. As public speaking students, we've conducted extensive research on the subject of Supreme Court nominations and also have experienced 3 processes within the last 2 years, giving us a unique line of knowledge and experience that we'd like to use to better inform you all. With that, though the current system is not flawless, we should not reform the Supreme Court nomination process as it maintains an essential balance of power in our government. And to explain that, today we will explore the background of each step in the nomination process and its significance. Second, we will explore why adding more justices to the Supreme Court is not a viable solution. And finally, we will explain how the current constitutional power distribution is the most effective and viable solution. Now, let's begin by first talking about each step in the Supreme Court nomination process and its significance. The need for a justice in the Supreme Court arises when there's a vacancy from a death, resignation, or retirement. With this, the president has the constitutional need to choose a justice and talk with the Senate to figure out who they would task. And additionally, it's the Senate's job to advise and then confirm this justice. And eventually the president nominates the candidate.
When going through a process like such, it's necessary to get the thoughts and opinions from those that come from different backgrounds. In addition to the president's selection method and the advice from the Senate, it's just as equally as important to get advice from more people. And really this should consist of looking beyond the surface, doing more rigorous research, looking for things that are small but could potentially cause a problem later on down the line. In an Observer article published October of 2018, it states the FBI's role in the judicial nomination process is unique. Prior to nominating an individual to office, the White House orders the FBI to conduct a confidential background investigation. This information is entirely discreet and it's not available to the public, but it should not be rushed, and everything should be broken down. Like I said, just checking for things that are small but can potentially cause a problem. From here, the committee and the Senate holds a hearing. It's a time for those both for and against the nominee. They vote on the nominee and can sign all recommendations to the full Senate, and it's up to them to debate and to make the best decision. According to a Georgetown Law Library article updated November 9th of 2018, the nominee goes to the full Senate for debate. They then vote to end the debate and then go on to the voting process. It requires a majority of 51 votes, and then from here the nominee is confirmed and sworn in. The process is determined by the Senate because really they make their own rules and always have, from how the committee and the debate are run to how many votes it takes to when the voting takes place. It's all in the hands of the Senate.
So additionally, we can see that this is where checks and balances come into play and how change is difficult to achieve, which keeps the system as a whole more stable. So the executive branch can nominate a candidate, but then that person must be then confirmed by the legislative branch and the more stable half of the legislative branch of that, which is the Senate. So neither has too much power when deciding who's going to be in the judicial branch at the national level. So now that we've explained the process, let's look at some common misconceptions regarding ways that the Supreme Court could be changed. So one of those common misconceptions is that the Supreme Court would be more effective if it had more justices. So some believe that there should not only be a change to the nomination process, but also a fundamental restructuring of the way the Supreme Court is run. So some believe that there should be more than 9 justices, which is what we currently have now. So according to an article from Time magazine titled "The Supreme Court Doesn't Need 9 Justices, It Needs 27," written by Jacob Russell, published on July 18th of 2018, they argued that the number of Supreme Court justices should increase so that the Supreme Court would be able to hear more cases and better reflect the views of the American people by being more democratic and effective, because they would be more representative and can include a more diverse group. So they argue that since we've grown as a nation, the Supreme Court should also grow to be able to hear more cases and better reflect the views of the American people. The major issue with this stance is that it confuses the branches of government. It is not the Supreme Court's job to reflect the views of the American people, that's Congress's job. The Supreme Court's job is to only deal with cases that affect constitutional law, and they hear a limited number of cases, and they pick which ones they hear, because again, their only job is to deal with cases that involve constitutional laws. And then other issues should be resolved in lower courts. So not all issues should end up at the Supreme Court. And this keeps the judicial branch at the national level more stable, since it does not directly follow the views of the ever-changing American public. Additionally, this change of adding more justices was already suggested, and it was shot down in 1937. So according to an article published by the History Channel titled "Roosevelt Announces the Court Packing Plan," published on February 9th of 2010, former President Franklin Roosevelt tried to pass legislation to increase the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to 15 to have more support for parts of his New Deal plan that were considered unconstitutional because they gave too much power to the executive branch. So if he would have been able to nominate more justices, the Supreme Court would have swung kind of in his direction, and his legislation could have been favored and passed when it really should not have been. So the Senate shot this legislation down pretty hard to add more justices. They voted against it 70 to 22, and that's a majority that we don't see too often anymore. So the idea of adding more justices is not a new one, and it was rejected over 80 years ago due to clear issues with making the Supreme Court more biased than it already is, since adding more members does not necessarily mean less biased one way or the other.
Now that we know why adding more judges has been tried and failed, let's discuss why weakening the Senate won't help either. Restricting the Senate's constitutional power will not fix the imperfections in the Supreme Court nomination process. One possible restructure that is considered is to limit the power the Senate has to turn down nominee hearings, like they did with the Obama administration in 2016. President Obama nominated Merrick Garland on March 16, 2016, just 32 days after Justice Scalia's death left a vacancy on the court. The Garland nomination was pending before the Senate for a total of 293 days, or approximately 10 months, before it was returned to President Trump. Of course, this is not taken too kindly, because both political parties recognize that a new appointment to the Supreme Court has the highest political stakes today. In a recent Gallup poll in Harvard Politics by Sidney Jung on August 15, 2018, a majority of American people, 62% of Republicans and 71% of Democrats and Independents, stated that the Supreme Court has become too partisan. Jay Cost, an author of a best-selling political novel, on September 17, 2018, stated that in the National Review, stated that it makes little sense for a body as power-hungry and ideological as the Senate to be choosing justices who wield such vast power. He states that it has come to the point where our institutions can no longer responsibly wield the power they have acquired, and that when it comes to nationalizing our institutions, nothing is off the table, which means to restrict the Senate's constitutional given power. The process of appointing justices has undergone many changes over 2 centuries, and attempted restructuring like the ones that have been mentioned before. But its most basic feature, the sharing of power between the President and the Senate, has remained unchanged, and there is a reason for this. The Constitution most basically states that to receive an appointment to the Supreme Court, he must first be nominated by the President and then confirmed by the Senate. This system works because since the President is the one to nominate, he must choose someone who will make it through the Senate. So for example, if the executive and legislative branches are opposing parties, he must choose someone who will be neutral enough to appease both of them. If the Senate's power to choose which nominee cases they hear is taken away, this will not only weaken the Senate, but the executive and judicial branches will be off balance too. And if you think about it, it doesn't make much sense for the Senate, the group that is voting in the nominee, to be overpowered by the nominee that they just elected in. This is why any further attempt to change the sharing of power between the President and the Senate would be destroying the most basic constitutional foundation that our founding fathers set for us. This is why the power that each branch holds should remain untouched.
Now that we have a clear understanding of the need for the Senate's power, let's review what we've talked about today. Though the current system is not flawless, the Supreme Court nomination process should not be reformed as it maintains an essential balance of power in our government. We showed this today by first discussing the background and importance of each step in the nomination process. Second, we showed how adding more justices to the Supreme Court is not a viable solution. And finally, we showed how the current constitutional power distribution is the most effective and balanced solution possible. Although this current Supreme Court nomination process has drawn much criticism in the past years, this has been without great constitutional support. The current system was put into place to create a government that maintains stability. While missing a ninth justice was unfortunate during Obama's presidency, the ability for the Senate to nominate or not to is essential to the power of checks and balances. Additionally, the creation of a larger court would be moving away from the primary goal of the judicial branch. And finally, while 300 days of blocking a nomination may seem like an abuse of power, ultimately, this is an example of the natural shift and flow of power that has made our government what it is today, a strong and stable entity.
Any questions?
Alright.
Yes.
Okay, so you said that adding Supreme Court justices would not like help with our judicial system at all.
Yeah.
But how else would you deal with the problems that there's like thousands of court cases that go for years and years without being read because there's so many court cases that get to the Supreme Court, but because there's so little justices and so little time for them to review them, that they don't get seen for like years at a time.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court, they were designed to not see that many cases, and they pick which ones they hear because they want to be very, very intentional about the rulings that they make regarding constitutional law. So they pick the ones that they feel are most important regarding constitutional law, and the other ones should be dealt with in lower courts. And then, so like other plans where you would increase, like the article suggested, increase the number to 27, okay? And then you have not every group of justices ruling on every case, which just kind of makes a lot of the problems a lot worse. Like it sounds really great, like okay, you'll have this group of justices that hears these cases and this group that hears these cases, so that everyone can hear more cases. But then you're like splitting up who's biased and then who you know is going to rule a certain way based on what cases they hear, and it makes the whole bias issue a lot worse.
So isn't that why you hire them? Because they,
Huh?
isn't that why you're hiring them?
It wouldn't really be a fair trial for everybody if that's the case, basically.
Yeah, like,
It's never a fair trial.
Well,
Like-
if not all the same judges are seeing every case, then it wouldn't be a fair trial for all cases because every case should be submitted the same.
Like, yes, they're supposed to be impartial. That doesn't always happen perfectly, but by adding more of them, that doesn't make that issue any better. It really just makes it a lot worse. So I get your point, and like we said, the current system is not flawless. It really does have some issues, but what we have is about the best that we can do, and any changes would really, really throw off that system and make it a lot worse. Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay.
I feel like you just go on.
You could, that's the nature of this issue. So the Supreme Court, obviously one branch of the three-tiered government, has been criticized as being overly politicized lately. And I think that people would make the argument that maybe that is the case. How do we take politics out of it? How do we make the Supreme Court less biased?
I mean, you really can't. Like, it's not a recent issue because since the early 1900s, they have been really biased, like taking away freedom of speech to protect the government and also swaying each way. So, I mean, I don't think there's not a great solution.
It's not a new issue. Like we hear things in the news. Oh, it's the worst it's ever been. And you start to look back and you're like, nah, guys, this is just one of the cycle. It's been this bad for a long time. So I think our position definitely is the current system is not perfect and it does have a lot of issues and the justices can be very biased. But you know that going in, and this is about the best we can do. And like I said, adding more people isn't going to help that issue.
What do you recommend? plan to help the issue then? Just leave it be, or let time roll its course, or do you suggest getting new members, or?
Well, as we said, we don't believe it's an issue, basically. The Supreme Court is what it is, and it'll act as, it's kind of like a different part of the government.
Like, when we were wondering the same question, but as we walked through our research and looked at those steps that we explained to you, as we looked at every step, each step is there for a really solid reason. Like, there's a reason that the Senate is the one to approve and not the House. And there's a reason that there's FBI checks, and there's reasons for every step in the process. So when we look through it, yeah, it's not perfect, but when you look at every step and the reasons behind it, it's a pretty solid process.
All right, we're out of time. Thank you very much.